At this stage, Scott thinks he's going to arrive in the Antarctic and have a clear run at the pole, but he receives a telegram, beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding south, Amundsen. It's basically, I've got a rival in the field.
When Robert Falcon Scott set out from Cardiff in 1910, it wasn't just about being first, or so he told himself. He was mounting a scientific expedition, a grand endeavour with a sprawling research programme, multiple parties, motorised sledges, ponies and dogs. The South Pole was a prize, yes, but it wasn't the only prize. And then a telegram arrived. Norwegian explorer Roland Amundsen was also headed south. The race was on. Scott versus Amundsen. A century and more later, it's a story that keeps pulling us back. It has everything: ambition, heroism, betrayal, tragedy. But what's got lost and distorted over time? Who really were these men? And what drove them to such extremes? We're going to answer those questions across the next 2 episodes with the help of Dr. Max Jones, a historian at the University of Manchester. His compelling book, The Last Great Quest, is the definitive account of how Scott's death became the sensation it did. Not just what happened on the ice, but what the story has meant and why we keep telling it. I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, vagabonds, and explorers for over 500 years. Hi Max, welcome to The Art of Adventure. Delighted to have you here. And I'm particularly excited because we're talking about the great race to the South Pole, Scott versus Amundsen. Who doesn't have an opinion on this?
Well, thank you. And just to say, I'm a fan of the podcast.
That's nice to hear. Flattery will get you absolutely everywhere on this programme. So Scott is one of those great figures that sort of looms over British culture, British society and British exploration. And you know, he was for so many years this amazing British hero. And in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, that perspective has changed somewhat. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about Scott, about who he was, the type of person he was, and perhaps why he sort of created this intrigue, argument and debate.
Excellent. Well, I think he does remain a compelling figure. At the beginning, because he seems a stereotypical Royal Naval officer. He's born in 1868 in the southwest. He doesn't go to Eton or Harrow. He goes to a naval training ship aged 13 and joins the Royal Navy and works his way up through the Royal Navy. His family are wealthy. His father has owned a brewery and retires and lives off the proceeds. And he's got a brother who goes into the army and 4 sisters. And so we have initially this vision of this sort of comfortable late Victorian figure who is a classic profile for the Royal Navy, wealthy background, heading towards becoming an officer. And by the 1890s, he's promoted to torpedo lieutenant, torpedoes being this new technology in the Royal Navy.
But he did have, I mean, he might have started off in a comfortable life, but I think his father went bankrupt, didn't he? And he ended up having to leave the Navy to support his mother. Was that right?
Absolutely. So I think it's all going nicely. He's progressed in the Navy. He's a rising officer. And then his father makes some unwise investments. He has to return to work and dies quite suddenly. And then even more shockingly, his brother Archie, serving in West Africa, the story is that he comes back to England on leave, contracts a disease after playing golf in Hythe in Kent and dies. So he survived the dangers of disease in Africa, but dies back in England. So suddenly we've got this young naval officer, Robert Falcon Scott, having to look after and provide for his mother Hannah and 3 unmarried sisters. And that's a real problem because in order to get on in the Royal Navy in this time, there is a social element. You've got to wear the right clothes, you've got to go to the right social events, you've got to socialize in a particular way. So promotion in the Royal Navy is certainly not entirely meritocratic, and not having enough money is going to be a barrier to advancement. And the legend tells that Scott met, chance encounter on a London street, the president of the Royal Geographical Society, Sir Clements Markham, who was obsessed with the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was his passion, and he used to go around with his cousin, by then Rear Admiral Albert Markham, and he'd go on voyages with his cousin Albert, and he'd look out and take notes on promising young naval officers. And the legend is that he'd taken some notes on this young Captain Scott, who he'd met a few years earlier in the West Indies, and then they meet on a London street, and Scott learns about this new national Antarctic expedition that Clements Markham wants to be led by a Royal Naval officer. Scott applies and he's appointed. So you're right, Hugh, that it very much, he's not someone brought up on tales of polar exploration who's dying to get to the South Pole. He's a man who's happy in his naval career, but who suffers some family tragedies, and through some chance meetings, Antarctic exploration offers him an opportunity for advancement.
And what was the fascination at the time with the South Pole? Why the South Pole? How important was it from a British perspective?
It's a good question to ask. It's always important. Sometimes we forget to ask these questions, to go, well, why? Why are the British interested in going to the South Pole? And I think that we can divide it broadly into 3 drivers, if you like, of exploration. First, there is an important element of power projection. Okay, so the government ends up spending a lot of money supporting Antarctic exploration, and it's because there is a race to the South Pole between 1895 and 1914. We get expeditions by Britain, by Belgium, by Japan, by Norway, by Germany, by France. America plans an expedition. So there's an extent, we're all familiar with the phrase, the scramble for Africa, but there's also a scramble for Antarctica. And in Africa, there's labor and resources to exploit. And let's not kid ourselves. Money is the reason that Britons are pouring into Africa in the second half of the 19th century. Of course, some religion as well, but money. Antarctica very different, because how can you make money when it's so difficult to get there? So the financial motive for Antarctic exploration, there's lots of money to be made whaling and sealing around the continent, but in terms of actually extracting resources, the difficulties of bringing them back to the market mean that, how much money are we going to make? But maybe there's strategic value and economic value in the future, and certainly power projection, planting the flag on the South Pole as a display of the power of the British Empire. So we've got power projection as a driver. We've got personal ambition. We shouldn't, Scott, we've talked about the charismatic merchant seaman Ernest Shackleton, who joins him on the National Antarctic Expedition. He's bored and he's searching for adventure. So power projection, personal ambition. And then I think it is important as well to put scientific curiosity into the mix as a really significant driver of what's going on. In 1895, a Norwegian, half British explorer, Carsten Borch Grevink, arrives in London at the International Geographical Congress. And he claims to have been, I'm the first man to have set foot on the Antarctic continent. And that really inspires the scientific community, because just to go to Antarctica with a thermometer and take a series of readings for a summer, let alone a year, to measure the wind, to measure the magnetism, to take geological specimens, you're really expanding and opening up our knowledge of the world at a time when academic disciplines are really modernizing in a form that we would be familiar with in university departments with a geography department, etc., etc. And then some historians have claimed, oh, science is just a veneer. This is all about adventure and patriotism and British pride. But I think when you look at the amount of money and resource put into the scientific research programs that were carried out, you have to take that motive very seriously. People were advancing the boundaries of knowledge, and we're still using the research that they conducted on those expeditions today.
So Scott gets recruited. Tell us about his first sort of voyage into the Antarctic. What happened and how did that lead to the second?
Okay, so the National Antarctic Expedition, as it was called, sets off in 1901 and it returns in 1904. Clements Markham, who'd been president of the Royal Geographical Society since 1893, it's very much his baby. And it's funded by the Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Society, a wealthy paint manufacturer called Llewellyn Longstaff. He gives £25,000, and the British government. And it's the most expensive British Antarctic expedition of the so-called heroic age, largely because they build this incredible ship, Discovery, this new specially designed ship.
With a lot of leaks as well, I think.
With a lot of leaks, exactly.
Yeah.
So a classic example of an expensive project that doesn't quite work out as well as people have liked. So Scott goes off with this merchant seaman, Ernest Shackleton, everyone's friend on the expedition, and a classic muscular Christian, Dr. Edward Wilson, a Cambridge-educated surgeon. Let's say he worshipped God by observing the wonders of creation. So he would sketch the environment. He had a great interest in wildlife. He was a man who fused his religious faith with scientific curiosity. So the three of them go off and they've got dogs and they've got ski, but they're not very good either at dog driving or at skiing. And we look back and it all looks a bit haphazard, that they were making it up as they go along, because no one had done this sort of traveling in detail in the Antarctic before. And I think it's legitimate to argue that they could have learned more from indigenous techniques of Inuit travel in the Arctic and taken those ideas to improve their own performance in the Antarctic. But they come up 480 miles from the pole, Shackleton, Scott and Wilson, and that gives them a suitably sensational headline. And they do an enormous amount of scientific research published in multiple volumes afterwards. However, it's a sort of 2 cheers rather than 3 cheers return for a few reasons. First problem comes that the Discovery gets iced in. There's a good chance that as the weather improved, it would have been released and it wouldn't have been a problem. However, back in London, Clements Markham begins panicking and raises an awful stink about we must send ships to relieve the Discovery. And the Admiralty eventually feels forced by public pressure to dispatch 2 ships to use explosives to blast the Discovery out of the ice and release it from the ice. And Scott's very annoyed because he thinks we could have done it all ourselves. And that sort of sours relations with the Admiralty. And Markham retires from being president of the RGS after the return of the ship, in part because of, it's really, this is really not good enough, because the Admiralty ends up spending thousands of pounds stepping in, which it hadn't wanted to do. And Scott does get promoted. He'd been commander and he gets promoted to captain. He's not given a knighthood, but it's delayed the promotion. And it's been argued that that's because it's to sort of express dissatisfaction. And then there's a dispute about the scientific results. Actually, looking back, when you look at the big picture, they produced amazingly valuable data and specimens that they collected, which remain used today, but it's heavily criticised afterwards. So his conduct as a naval captain and his the scientific results of the expedition are criticised. That's why it's 2 cheers. But he does become a bit of a celebrity in London, and he goes back into the Navy. Then, much to his annoyance, Shackleton goes and gets money from a shipping magnate, William Meermore, and organises his own expedition to the South Pole. It might seem ridiculous to us now, but there was the sense of social hierarchy is so strong in Edwardian Britain that it's, well, look, you're my subordinate. I've given you a chance. You should ask me if I give you my permission to go to the Antarctic, which I think he would have tried to say, no, you can't go.
But also because it was merchant navy versus Royal Navy as well, on top of the sort of social order.
Absolutely. And Scott was very much the establishment man. The Royal Geographical Society is very much Royal Naval establishment government. So Shackleton, no doubt, is an outsider, but partly succeeding through force of personality. The Nimrod expedition that Shackleton then leads, it's a smaller expedition than the Discovery, but they still do some great geological work and scientific research. And most dramatically, Shackleton, he gets within 97 miles of the South Pole with 3 companions, Adams, Marshall, and Wild, and turns back. Why do they turn back? You can't live on the land in the Antarctic. Once you can live on the coast because there's seal life, penguin, so there's things you can eat. It's just a massive ice cap on the continent. So you can't live on the ice. You have to carry all your food and all your fuel. And he calculates, well, we could get to the pole, but we will all die on the way back. So they get as close as possible, break that 100-mile barrier, and then they go back. He then tells his wife, Emily, I thought you would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion.
I mean, it was phenomenally close, actually, wasn't it? And obviously the Shackleton exhibition returns to London, again to quite a lot of adulation. Scott, meanwhile, is feeling a bit frustrated.
Absolutely, because Shackleton gets a knighthood. Shackleton, more a natural in the spotlight, becomes friends with Arthur Conan Doyle. King Edward VII finds Shackleton he's a real character and an entertaining presence. So Scott is just feeling, he's annoyed that his subordinate has led his own expedition to the Antarctic. He's doubly annoyed because Wilson had got an agreement from Shackleton that he wouldn't use Scott's old base from the Discovery expedition, but a storm ends up meaning that he really has no choice but to go into his own base.
It was a strange thing to say anyway. It's pretty unhelpful to say, well, if you are going to go, you can't use my base.
Absolutely. Well, I think it reflects ultimately in this sense of the propriety within that social order that Scott just felt he shouldn't have been doing it, that somehow everybody knew he still wanted to lead an expedition, and therefore it was inappropriate for his former subordinate to act. So that's why I think it was a sort of grudging compromise. But you're right, certainly to a modern sensibility, it seems unjustifiable.
I mean, and Scott pretty much seems about the only person who was immune to the charms of Shackleton.
I mean, he must have been charmed on the Discovery because he takes him with Wilson. And my understanding is that they remained friends after the return of the Discovery, but that they fell out first because on the way back from the farthest south on the Discovery expedition, there'd been a period where Shackleton had sat on the sledge to act as a sort of windbreak to slow it down even on certain occasion. And another occasion, he was suffering badly from scurvy, and so he stopped pulling and walked beside the sledge. But in Scott's account of the expedition, he suggests that Shackleton was so ill that Wilson and Scott, dragged him on the sledge, and that wasn't true. And of course, that was really quite an accusation. So I think that was a key factor.
Didn't Shackleton get back to London first?
Yes, he did.
And slightly, in Scott's eyes, slightly take quite a lot of the glory for the success of the expedition.
No, absolutely. I think that ego and honours are part of what Antarctic exploration is generating in this period. And we can see in the dispute between them, it's partly a dispute about territory and honours and status. Just by the way, as there is a dispute between the two Norwegians, Amundsen and Nansen. Nansen lends the Fram to the Norwegian Roald Amundsen for an Arctic expedition. But the two fall out without asking Nansen's permission.
All the backers of the expedition.
All the backers of the expedition. Amundsen secretly changes his mind and sails south. And again, I don't think Nansen would have given permission, because although it does seem unlikely it would have happened, he still harboured his own dreams that actually he might mount an expedition on the South Pole. So seems a bit far-fetched now, but he wasn't ready, I think, to let them go.
So Shackleton is back. Scott is back in the Navy. Talk us through how he ended up leading the 1910 expedition and then actually what happened on it.
So he goes back into the Royal Navy. He's been promoted to captain, and he marries this remarkable woman, Kathleen Bruce, a sculptor who's trained with Rodin, a bohemian, charismatic woman in her own right. They have a young son, Peter, who would later become the famous naturalist. So things are going very well, but he's got an itch, which is those 97 miles. He wants to bag the pole for Britain and prove that he's a better man than Shackleton. And because he's still operating within an exploring tradition defined by the Royal Geographical Society, it's not just a pole hunt. The RGS are, oh no, we don't like that. The form of exploration that the Society of Scientific Exploration dictated that they also had to have a very detailed research program. And when they announced the expedition, they announced that Scott says that he wants to reap the greatest possible scientific harvest in the Antarctic. So right from the beginning, we've got these dual purposes. We're going to have a big set of professional scientists carrying out scientific research at the base camp. And then we're also going to try and place the Union Jack on the South Pole.
And wasn't it even more complex than that? Because, I mean, we'll come on to it, but Amundsen's objective was very simple, to be the first person to the South Pole. Scott, you obviously had scientific exploration, you had the South Pole, you had testing equipment, I think was objective. You had seeing men under hardship or enduring hardship as part of it. There was quite a multifaceted list of objectives he was given by both the Navy and the RGS.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And one thing that seems clear to me is that if you are attempting a very challenging objective in an extreme environment, you need to be absolutely single-minded, and you need to eliminate chance as much as possible. You never know. You can go over a crevasse, extreme weather. So there will inevitably be unexpected obstacles that you have to navigate. But the most successful travelers who achieve their goals are ruthlessly single-minded and plan. And there can be no doubt, looking back, that the British Antarctic expedition on board the Terra Nova that sets off in June 1910 from Cardiff, it had an astonishingly wide range of objective. It dropped off 25 men in the Antarctic in January 1911 after a very difficult voyage, by the way.
It almost sunk, didn't it?
Absolutely. They were unlucky. We can see we've got a much better sense now of the seasonal flow of conditions, and they were unlucky for the conditions they encountered on the voyage down, which delayed them, and they finally landed in early January 1911. And we've got 25 men establishing a base camp. There's also a 30-odd crewmen remain on the Terra Nova, and they've got a program of research. They're not going to make the same mistake again. They leave before the winter ice freezes and sail and conduct their own navigations, drop news off back in New Zealand, where it can then be transmitted by telegraph cable around the world. And then we've got a western party and a northern party and a southern party. So there's an enormous amount going on in this expedition. And in retrospect, one thinks, well, Scott would have had a better chance of winning the race to the South Pole had he led a smaller, more streamlined expedition with a single goal. However, as I said, that wasn't really an option for him coming out of this naval and Royal Geographical Society tradition of exploration, which encouraged this sort of grand endeavour.
And I think this sort of mixed objective, a lot of the criticism levelled at Scott, is this organisational bit that he wasn't seen by some to be a great organiser. And I think because there were so many strands to the expedition, it just made it incredibly difficult. Whereas, as you said, Amundsen, it was very simple, very straightforward, and very ruthless approach.
I think that's right. But they did conduct some scientific research as well. So sometimes it's implied that they did nothing. But Amundsen's expedition on board the Fram does carry out some research. And it's important because, as I said earlier, any measurement with decent instruments and record is making a contribution at this time. But it's much, much less.
Yeah, I think with Amundsen, it was a nice to have, wasn't it? Whereas with Scott, it was a key part of the expedition.
Absolutely.
So they set off from Cardiff. They have a pretty torrid voyage. Tell us about a telegram that they received on the journey.
So they arrive in Melbourne, and at this stage, Scott thinks he's going to arrive in the Antarctic and have a clear run at the pole. But he receives a telegram, beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding south, Amundsen. And that's all it says, but it's basically, I've got a rival in the field. And Scott knows Amundsen. He tried to meet him and speak to him to get advice from him. But Amundsen hid in his house because he didn't want to have to lie to his face and tell him that he was going to the Antarctic. What happened was that Amundsen had already achieved the Northwest Passage in the mid-1900s, so he'd already proved himself to be a supreme polar traveller, learning from Inuit techniques to help navigate the Arctic archipelago. And Nansen wanted to get to the North Pole, gets the ship Fram from Nansen for the North Pole, but two Americans, Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, both announced that they have reached the North Pole in 1909. And the RGS and most of the geographical establishment ends up backing Robert Peary's claim. So suddenly Amundsen has no He's planning this Arctic expedition, but the main aim has been taken away. So the team set off, and he tells them he's got a crew. He tells them that he's going, and they'll just do some research and some surveying in the Arctic. But they get to Madeira, and he puts a notice on the mast essentially explaining what's happened and saying, I'm going to sail south and try and beat Captain Scott to the South Pole. And if any of you want to get off now, that's absolutely fine. I'll pay you up. Important point. And none of them did. They all elect to go with him. And the Fram is filled with dogs. 120 dogs at least. It's going to be very much an attempt on swift polar travel using dog sledges.
Yeah. And it's also worth pointing out, as we alluded to at the beginning, that he had hidden his objective from the Nansen who owned the boat, the investors who backed the expedition, the government, the press, and his crew until Madeira. So nobody knew his plans.
Exactly. Amundsen later felt that there were sour grapes about his victory. And I think there were. However, it wasn't simply a case of, oh, you're a Norwegian who beat a Brit, because there was genuine room for disgruntlement. The Royal Geographical Society gave a few £100 to Amundsen to go to the Arctic. So he's ending up using the money of the Royal Geographical Society to compete with their own expedition that they're backing. So I think the sour grapes, the eventual sour grapes, are understandable given what you said in terms of what he'd had to do in order to cover up his intentions. And he did it because there's a strong likelihood he would have been stopped, not least because Norway has only achieved independence from Sweden in 1905. It's a tiny nation. There could have been diplomatic pressure for him to back down. There was a sense still, we don't want to annoy the mighty British Empire. So I think there is an element of he felt, I've got to keep this quiet or someone is going to stop me.
So Scott receives the telegram, discovering that Amundsen's actually got the same objective as him. So what does he do? Does he change his plans? Does he focus on just doing the South Pole?
So it's a good question. And first, they are angry. And it's come out more recently as diaries have been released, the extent of annoyance, even to the extent both the ships actually meet after Scott has got off, I should add. So after they've disembarked in January, the ships meet and the crews meet, and some of them are very angry. But of course, they behave themselves and have a meal together and exchange pleasantries. But there is, we now know, it's not just sort of polite, oh dear, that's annoying. There's seething tension and some people talking about going to confront them on the Fram, etc. So you ask, what does he change? Well, I think we come back to this point about the size of the expedition. One might expect it might be right. I need to change my plans. I've just got to get there as quickly as possible. But the expedition is such a complicated endeavor. There are so many moving parts. That was always going to be difficult for two reasons. Partly because of the sheer size, and partly because it was so difficult to cover I'll just call it 900 miles from the base camp to the South Pole. So they've got this plan to use dogs and pony sledges and motor sledges, these brand new motor sledges. And that immediately after they arrive, which is in the summer in Antarctica, they are going to, as quickly as possible, go off on a supply laying expedition. So they'll go as far south as they can, laying caches of food and fuel that they'll then be able to use on the polar journey. And then they have to go back to base camp. And from, I don't know, we say sort of mid-April to mid-September, you can't travel very easily during the Antarctic winter because the conditions are so bad. The sun disappears, the temperatures plummet. So why don't they rush for the pole? They can't. They don't have the resources to allow them to do it. They've got to lay these supply depots, then wait it out. And then they do try and leave as early as possible, but partly the weather is still bad in the spring through October. So Amundsen and Scott know they're racing, and both expeditions are desperate to get off. Amundsen starts off and turns back because he started too early. He's very worried about these motor sledges he's heard about. They end up not being that effective because their engines keep breaking down in the extreme environment. But it's important to note, we shouldn't, Amundsen really thought, gosh, that they might win the pole for the British. And then Scott eventually is able to head off at the end of October 1911, having waited out the winter. So that's a long answer to your question again of saying, well, what do they change? They don't. They pretty much carry out the plan as it was and present that as magnanimity, and that they were never racing.
Right.
That this is a scientific expedition. We want to place the flag at the pole, but, this was never a race. So they take the moral high ground.
Right. So Scott leaves October 1911 to the South Pole.
Yes.
Talk us through the journey there and what happens when he gets there.
So Scott then sets off around 31st October 1911. And he's going to use motor sledges and sledge dogs and ponies, which he's transported, and they're going to help carry their supplies. And a bigger party will set off, and then a first supporting party will come back, and then a second supporting party will come back, and then a final party. Initially, he plans a final party of 4 men will go on to the pole, picking up then when they return food and fuel at the supply depots that were laid earlier in the year and that they've also laid as they've gone out, roughly every 80 miles along the route. And then there are 3 aspects, 3 terrains to navigate. You've got to do 425 miles across the Ross Ice Shelf, what they called the Great Ice Barrier. And then you've got to do 125 miles up the Beardmore Glacier. This was the route that Shackleton had pioneered. And that's going to take you up to the polar plateau, which is 8,000 to 10,000 feet above sea level, this just enormous plateau of ice. And then you've got about 350 miles across the polar plateau to the South Pole and back. So you've got these 3 phases, the Great Ice Barrier, the Ross Ice Shelf, the Beardmore, and then the polar plateau. Scott uses dogs and motor sledges and ponies, but here's the crucial point. He doesn't think he can get any of those forms of transport up the glacier. So he thinks at some point as he's on the Beardmore that he's going to have to just switch, and they'll have to manhaul all the way from there and back. And manhauling sledges, I've never done it myself, but I've read many accounts of it. But manhauling sledges in extreme temperatures does sound like one of the more exquisite forms of torture that human beings can put themselves through. So this was going to be a test of physical and mental endurance.
So he decides to basically ditch the dogs, ditch the ponies, ditch the motorised sledges,
Yeah.
and it's manhauling. And manhauling was slightly in the British DNA in the Great Age of Exploration, wasn't it? It was considered a worthy practice.
Well, this is a controversial point. There's no doubt Sir Clements Markham, remember the patron of the Discovery, president of the Royal Geographical Society, he certainly loved manhauling. He thought manhauling was the supreme test of manly character, the British way. So there's no doubt that that ethos was circulating at this time. However, my own view is that most of the members of the British expedition didn't subscribe to that. They just wanted to use the most efficient form of polar transport that they could. They used, and then when they had exhausted them, ate ponies and dogs, even though they were squeamish about it and didn't like it. They did do it. The only main player in the expedition who I found who really echoes Markham with dogs is Henry Bowers, this Scottish Royal Indian Marine, who was an astonishing physical specimen. He'd go out of the expedition, had to wipe himself down with ice to clean himself. And he had elaborate and obscure theological beliefs. And part of his I'll call them idiosyncratic view of the world was he absolutely did think manhauling was the British way and the only way there. But if you read Scott's last journal, his detailed account of the expedition, he doesn't say that manhauling is noble and manhauling is the British way. So my own view is that he would have been happy to have used dogs, ponies and motor sledges to get to the pole, but he didn't think he could get them up the Beardmore.
Talk us through from where they ditch the dogs and everything else to when they get to the South Pole.
So they are on the polar plateau. We now know that their rations were woefully inadequate because they didn't fully understand the effect of altitude on your calorific needs. So they were starving the entire time they were on the plateau. And Scott has a decision to make. There are 8 men and he's got to choose a polar party of 4. And he changes his mind at the last minute. And we know it was at the last minute because he told one of the men he chose, this Royal Indian Marine Bowers, to stow his skis earlier. But then he changes his mind and chooses Bowers, and he ends up choosing a final polar party of 5 men.
Which is more than was planned for, and obviously more than they had anticipated with rations.
Exactly. Now, I'm hesitant because he hasn't published it yet, but there is a very diligent and meticulous New Zealand researcher called Bill Alb who is working on this 5th man issue. And I've been corresponding with him by email. He defends the 5th man decision as a rational decision because the polar plateau is equivalent to the death zone at the top of Everest. It's so high, the calorific needs, the environment, you really have got to get off the polar plateau as soon as possible. The idea being an extra man gives you more pulling power, so you'll get to the pole and back quicker and reduce your time on the plateau.
So having less rations doesn't matter because you're going to do it quicker.
Well,
that's the thinking, presumably.
Yes. Now, my argument would be all the rations have been divided up and the fuel. So by switching from 4-man parties to a 5-man and a 3-man party, you are increasing the time you have to spend distributing your fuel and your food all the time.
Yeah.
And we come back to that point right at the beginning about efficient traveling in extreme environments. You want to make it all as easy as possible. I think, yes, you've got more pulling power, but you've introduced a significant element of disruption. So my own view is that we can criticize this decision, but it is a debate.
Right. Okay. So they set off with 5 men in total, including Scott. What happens in that last part of that journey then?
So Bowers is also the best surveyor, using a theodolite, taking observations and plotting where they are. And they get close to the pole and they see dog tracks. And then Bowers spots a black flag tied to a tent. So in the middle of March 1912, they arrive at the South Pole to discover that Amundsen has got there first. And there's a tent inside with a note from Amundsen. He's worried he might die on the return. So it's a record, and please pass this record on to the King of Norway. So you can imagine the incredible disappointment of the British party. We have Scott, we have Bowers, we have Dr. Edward Wilson, the muscular Christian from the Discovery expedition. And then we have another former crew member from the Discovery expedition, Petty Officer Edgar Evans. And then the fifth man, a cavalry officer, Lawrence Oates, who'd served in the South African War and who'd bought his way onto the expedition for £1,000. And they took this terribly poignant series of photographs at the South Pole that I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is familiar with. And Scott wrote in his journal, "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have got here without the reward of priority." You can soul destroyed.
It was still an achievement to get to the South Pole. I mean, they were only the second group of people to do that.
And Amundsen had only got there just over a month before. And I don't think anyone else would stand at the South Pole until Edmund Hillary in 1958 on the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic expedition. So this is, as you say, still an incredible achievement to have got there. But they then face a 900-mile journey to get back. And initially they're optimistic. He thinks, well, we want to try and race back and maybe we'll beat Amundsen back and then we'll be able to be the first to announce what's happened at the South Pole.
But presumably they realised at that stage they were 34 days behind Amundsen.
Yes, they did. One can only think as well, they thought, they knew how dangerous the environment was, so they knew he might as well encounter an accident on the return journey. So it might be left to them actually to break the story to the world. And they were also hoping to get back so that they could announce what had happened so that a ship could then get out before the ice froze, which is what happened with Amundsen. So he did get back in time and the ship was able to get free and go and reach Tasmania, where the story is telegraphed around the world in March 1912.
The world may have heard the news that the Norwegian explorer had reached the South Pole first, but there was no word from Scott. His fate is a question that would grip the world for months. In our next episode, Dr. Max Jones is back as we follow Scott's tragic march back across the ice. Join us next time where the journey continues. The Art of Adventure is brought to you by Arthur Beale. That's BEALE.co.uk. Outfitters to sailors, adventurers, vagabonds and explorers for over 500 years. And for this series, listeners of the podcast can get 15% off any Arthur Beale product at our website. Simply use the code PODCAST at checkout. Please head to arthurbeale.co.uk. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, and produced by M. Wally. Theme music is by Nassan De Silva.